So the next unit gets a little more interesting, being the muscular system. The first two are kind of boring and dry. So off we go. What are the functions? Before we even get into it, walking in here today, you guys already know what the function of, say, skeletal muscle is, or have a pretty good idea, don't you? What would you say the function of skeletal muscle is? Movement. Okay, they attach to bones and they allow us to move, right? Now, we've got other muscle too, not just skeletal. Do we know what the other two types of muscle are? Smooth, I think. My hearing's so bad, I just assume you get it right. And how about that thing that beats in your chest? Cardiac. Okay, cool. So cardiac we talk about more in 202. It gets kind of its own unit, but we'll touch on it here, this unit. So function of muscles. We move body parts, and we move things through our body, primarily through peristalsis, and that's done by smooth muscle in our GI tract. You've probably heard the term peristalsis. So that's the wave-like contraction of that smooth muscle, moving things through our GI tract so we can first break it down and then take nutrients out of it. Another functions maintain posture and prevent movement. So not only do muscles allow us to move, they can keep us standing still, keep us sitting or standing upright, which is important. Smooth muscle also controls what are called sphincters. Okay, sphincters, and then there's some capillary pre-capillary sphincters that control where blood goes. Okay, I know we haven't got into capillaries or whatnot, but they're basically, think of a webbing around a tissue or cell that blood flows through, like a spider web type situation. And there's sphincters that allow blood to go into that capillary or not, depending on if we need to. Okay, we don't need to send blood to our GI tract unless we've eaten. Okay, we keep it more in our circulation or to our skeletal muscles to keep us doing our activities. But after we've eaten a big meal, we do send a lot of blood to our GI tract, and that's why you feel a little bit lethargic. You don't have as much blood going to your skeletal muscles at that point. And then the last one, body heat production. Okay, muscles will contract and relax, shivering, to generate a little bit of heat. When muscles contract, one of the byproducts that they give off is heat. Okay, so muscle structure. Well, first, just for fun here, well, not fun, but how many muscles do you think are in the body? About 600, okay? You're going to learn all 600. Just kidding. Actually, don't even learn nearly that, but it'll feel like that at times. Kind of the same question we asked you with bones. How many bones were there in the skull? Felt like there was 1,000. All right, so the structural unit of skeletal muscle. This unit's mostly about skeletal muscle. Okay, so assume skeletal muscle unless I tell you otherwise. The cell is called a fiber, a muscle fiber, and that's because it's so long. Okay, so think of like a hair. Somebody with long hair, it's a long, thin muscle fiber. Cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, they'll call them myocytes, prefix being myo, being muscle, cyte being cell. Okay, but for the skeletal muscle, they'll often refer to it as a muscle fiber. Okay, it's made up of smaller subunits called myofibrils, and like I said, they don't call it a muscle cell or a myocyte. They call it a fiber, and that's because it's so long. And because it's so long, it's going to give us some unique characteristics versus the other types of muscle, one of which it's going to have more than one nucleus. Okay, most cells have one nucleus. This is so long, if you think of this, the nucleus as the brain of the cell, it's oftentimes too far from the rest of the cell to control it properly. So there's more than one nucleus in that long fiber. All right, so we take these muscle fibers and we're going to bundle them together into a group or a bunch, and we're going to call that bunch a fascicle. Okay? So a fascicle is a group or a bunch of muscle fibers. We take a bunch of those fascicles and we bundle them together, and that's what we think of as a muscle when we name our biceps brachii, our triceps, our pectoralis major, our gastrocnemius. The muscles we think of are actually groups of fascicles clustered together. Okay? The ones we'll name in lab. Oops, sorry. Okay with that? So far, so good. Pretty simple. Now, we had connective tissue around bones, right? What do we call the connective tissue that wrapped around bones? Periosteum, right? And then when we had a joint, there was connective tissue surrounding the outside of the joint. We call that the capsule, the fibrous capsule. Okay? Everything pretty much has connective tissue wrapped around it. Muscles are no different. Okay? So we're going to look at the connective tissue that wraps around a muscle fiber, what wraps around a fascicle, and what wraps around the actual muscle itself that we name a muscle. Okay? It's real simple. The muscle fiber has a thin layer of connective tissue around it known as the endomysium. Okay? And it's a large portion of its areolar connective tissue, which we remember, is that a loose or a dense? Loose. So the advantage of being a loose connective tissue, there was space for blood vessels and nerves, right? Which is important. We have to have nerves to innervate the muscles. We have to have blood vessels there to nourish the muscles. Okay, so you guys nailed that. Then we took muscle fibers, we bundled those together, and what did I call that on the last slide? Fascicle, okay? So now we have what's called the perimysium that wraps around the fascicle. Once again, it's connective tissue. It's a little thicker this time, but it surrounds those clusters of muscle fibers known as a fascicle. And then we took the fascicles, we bundled those together, and that's what we think of as a muscle. It's going to have connective tissue around it. It's called the epimysium. Okay? So the epimysium covers the whole muscle belly. Once again, it's connective tissue, and it's even thicker than the perimysium. And it kind of separates the muscles out. Have any of you in high school biology or whatever, did you like dissect any frogs or anything like that? No? Okay. You notice when you pull the skin off of the legs, you can actually see the divide between where one muscle runs and the next muscle. Okay? And the connective tissue around there, you can often see that looks kind of white, is the epimysium. All right? It separates them out. We could get into it, it's not that important, but some of that's referred to as fascia. Okay, that connective tissue. So cool with that so far. All right, so let's see if we can name some of this stuff. So we got a picture of a muscle. Doesn't matter what this is. We'll call it the sartorius. Okay? We've cut it. We've done a cross section of right through here, and we're looking at it like this. Okay? What's the connective tissue that goes around the outside of the muscle, what we know of as a muscle? Epimysium? Good. And what are these things here in the center that make up this sartorius muscle? Yeah, each one of these is a fascicle. Good. And it's covered by the epimysium. Very good. All right. So now what they did here is they took that sartorius, they pulled out what you guys just called a fascicle, and you were right. And we have connective tissue that wraps around it, and it's called the perimysium. Good. And this thing that makes up the fascicle would be a what? Muscle fiber. All right. Then we took this muscle fiber, put a cross section through it, and we're looking at it this way. And by the way, when you're looking at pictures like this, when you see this kind of striped appearance, that's called striations. Skeletal muscle striated, the muscle fiber itself is striated, so this is what it would look like. So that's another indication that this is a actual muscle fiber. Cross section of it, we have connective tissue that wraps around it, and it's called endomysium. Good. And it's made up of smaller subunits known as myofibrils. Okay. Good with that? Which time? Okay, so this is a muscle fiber, okay? It's covered by the endomysium, all right? And it's made up of smaller subunits inside here known as myofibrils, okay? And we're actually going to drill down even smaller than myofibrils to what are called myofilaments, and we look at how muscles contract. So that's what we're working up to. Okay? So let's see if we got it. The fascicle is surrounded by what? Epimysium, endomysium, paramysium. Okay, how many think it's number 1? How many think it's number 2? Okay, how many think it's number 3? It is number 3. Oh! So let's go back real quick. All right, so you guys said this was a muscle, these were fascicles. Okay, so we pulled out a fascicle, did a cross-section around there, and you told me it was the paramysium. All right? Just that one fascicle. When we bundle the fascicles together like this, now this whole thing is a muscle, and what goes around that's the epimysium. Okay? Now do we feel better about it? All right, cool. Once again, a lot of these things, once you get it, it's not that hard, but until you get it, it kind of is like, what the hell? And if you let too many of them build up, then you just feel like you're getting washed away. So characteristics of muscle. So we've got about 6 characteristics of muscle we'll talk about. Different types of muscle. Most of the muscles have these same characteristics. Okay. The first one is muscles said to be responsive. It's excitable. That simply means it responds to signals. These signals are nerve stimuli. Okay. Skeletal muscle has to have a nerve tell it to contract. If it doesn't, if the nerve can't tell it to contract, what do we say about that muscle? It's paralyzed. Okay? All right? So the muscle won't do anything, skeletal muscle won't do anything unless it's told to contract. Okay? It responds with electrical changes across its plasma membrane. And I know right now that means nothing to us, okay? Because we haven't talked about resting membrane potentials or anything like that just yet, okay? But cells have a charge, okay? There's generally a higher concentration of negative anions inside the cell versus positive cations outside the cell. And when this muscle responds, when it's stimulated, that polarization flips. The inside becomes generally more positive than it was, okay? Skeletal muscles are conductive. Not only does the change on the membrane happen right there where the stimulus took place, it will conduct that change down the whole length of the muscle fiber, okay? And the reason for that is, as we said, the skeletal muscle fiber is made up of myofibrils. I said we're going to get even lower where there's talked about myofilaments. So when that muscle fiber is stimulated, we want all the myofilaments up and down there to get that signal. They all have to work, okay? Does that make sense? So that's why we conduct it down there, to make sure that they all get it. Contractile. This you probably knew. When a muscle is stimulated, its response, if the stimulus is strong enough, is to contract. It shortens. The two ends get closer together. Okay? So muscles always, do they always pull or do they always push? Pull. Muscles always pull. All right, so they pull when it's a skeletal muscle and it's running from my scapula down here to my forearm. It shortens, it's going to pull this end closer to this end. That contracts my arm. Muscles never push. So when I go from here to here, the muscle contracted. How did I go back? Did the muscle push? No, what happens? Other muscles on the other side contract. And they're going to be called antagonists. All right, so another characteristic of muscle's extensible. That's just a fancy way of saying it can be stretched. Okay? Now, not only can muscles be stretched, they're elastic, and that simply means that they can recoil back to their original length after being stretched. All right? And ultimately, there'll always be a few of you that'll get these confused. Okay? You'll say characteristic muscles is elastic. It can be stretched. Now, elastic means it can recoil back to its original length after being stretched. The stretch is the extensibility. Okay? And then lastly, muscle can convert chemical energy stored in ATP into mechanical energy, which is energy to do work. In this case, the work is movement, contraction. Okay? You guys have heard of ATP, right? Adenine triphosphate? All right. That's the energy currency in the body. Anything that happens in the body that requires energy, that's where we get it from. Okay? We break a phosphate bond. When we break bonds, energy is released. We use that energy to help the muscles contract. So how are we doing so far? Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. We're just kind of learning a few terms and a few players in the game. Good? All right. So true or false, muscles are said to be elastic, meaning they can be stretched. Ah, good job. Normally, even after I say that, I get people like, true. All right. Good job. All right, so we said we have connective tissue around the muscles. They have characteristics as well. Okay, so what were the connective tissue around the muscles? Around the muscle fiber was the the endomysium, right? The connective tissue around the fascicle was the paramecium. Good. Now we're going. And the connective tissue around the muscle itself that we think of as a muscle is the epimysium. All right. Coffee, people. Coffee. Lots of it. All right. So that connective tissue, those layers have properties. Okay? Now, they're not excitable. They're not contractile. Okay? They're connective tissue. They do not respond to stimuli. All right? The muscle does, but not the connective tissue. However, they are somewhat extensible and somewhat elastic. Okay? So they do have the ability to be stretched, which is good. If you put a substance around the muscle, a connective tissue, and it wasn't able to be stretched, well, the muscle underneath it would then be limited on how it could be stretched. So they both can be stretched, they're both extensible, and they're both elastic, so they recoil back. And so because they share the same properties as the muscle, this characteristic is said to help with the muscle's efficiency, makes it more efficient. Okay? If you were a builder of some sort and you had somebody that came along and did the same thing you did, they were a builder and they were working with you, they would make you more efficient, right? They would help you. All right? So stretches slightly under tension and then recoils when released. So this is said to help, this property helps return them to their resting length after they're done, and we say that means they helped with the efficiency of the muscle. All right. Now, muscles attach to what? Bones, good. And they do it, oh, question.
Do we have a bullet point above not excitable mark or unsatisfied?
Just, yeah, ignore it. So she just told us muscles attach to bone. Exactly right. How do they attach to bone? Is it the muscle directly attaching to the bone? Does it change into something else that attaches to the bone? Yeah, close, not ligaments. Tendons, there we go. So muscles can directly attach to the bone. More commonly, they'll attach with a tendon. Okay? So there's two types of connections. You guys just nailed them both. All right? We have what's called a direct fleshy attachment to the bone. This is where the epimysium that comes off the muscle, it's wrapped around the muscle, comes off the muscle, and blends in and becomes the connective tissue that wraps around the bone that we know is the periosteum. Okay? There is no tendon. It's a direct attachment. Okay? It's not the strongest attachment, but it's one way that these can attach. Okay? The second was with a tendon that you guys mentioned. In this case, this is called an indirect attachment, and the epimysium comes off the muscle. Think of it as kind of thickening up, almost like you wrap it around the muscle and you come off, and then you kind of thicken it up, roll it up together, and now you blend it in to the periosteum of the bone. And not only do you blend it into the periosteum of the bone, you have some fibers that actually penetrate down into the bone matrix, almost like we stapled it there. Do you guys remember what those fibers were called? Sharpie's fibers. Good. Okay, merges into the periosteum, came up as perforating. So we had perpendicular fibers, perforating fibers, or Sharpie's fibers, but you got it right. Okay? And it helps to anchor it there. It makes it really strong. Stress will tear the tendon or break the bone before pulling the tendon loose from either the muscle or the bone. So this is just a statement telling you this is a really strong connection, okay? And oftentimes when a tendon ruptures, it'll actually pull off a piece of the bone when it does that. The bone will break, okay? And that doesn't happen to us normally. You'll see those types of injuries with football players, okay? They'll tear a triceps or they'll tear a pec muscle. And oftentimes it's because the muscle got bigger and stronger before the bone thickened up to handle it, okay? And that might be an indication they were using something to help the muscle grow faster, okay? We also have attachment to the dermis. Where would skeletal muscle attach to the dermis? The skin, but where in the skin? Obviously this dermis is part of the skin, but how about an area? Out in the face, all right? How'd you throw woo at somebody this weekend? You know, you winking your eyes, raising your eyebrows, smiling, you know? No? You guys don't throw woo at anybody when you're out? Ladies, you don't like free drinks? Like, what the hell? I don't know what's wrong with you. We got to work with you guys, all right? There's a comedian, Jim Jeffries. He does a whole thing on women don't know how much drinks cost because they never pay for them, ever. All right? So, I'm not making you feel bad if you pay for your own drinks, sorry. But there's usually somebody. You can be nice to them for a minute, they buy you a drink, and then you blow them off. That's what you ladies do. All right? The ones that are laughing have done that many a time. They're like ratting me out. All right. So, coordinated muscle action. So what we're going to look at here, we're going to take one example. We're going to give you a joint. The joint's going to be the elbow joint. Okay? And we're going to talk about one action. The action's going to be flexion. And if we do that, if we give you a joint and we give you an action, then there's muscles that have certain roles in that action, okay? And we're going to list them here for that. So the first one is called the prime mover or the agonist. It's the muscle most responsible for that movement at that joint, okay? So if we determine the movement is flexion, we have a prime mover is the one that does most of that work. Do we know what muscle that is? I realize we haven't started muscles yet, but those of you like me that maybe work out and you actually sit at a machine and read the little placard more than you actually work out, what muscle would that be? Biceps, okay? Biceps brachii. Oops. So it's the one that produces most of the force at that action. And so we go to a picture here. We've got shoulder joint, elbow joint. We got the muscles running down in front, the muscles behind. This is the one that does most of the work. It's called biceps brachii. Okay? It's our prime mover. All right? Some joints, some actions at some joints also have what's called a synergist. The synergist helps the prime mover. It doesn't do the most of the force, but it does help. Okay? So it's doing the same thing. All right? Sometimes it's more stabilizing the joint than actually doing the work. Sometimes it's modifying the direction of movement a little bit. But all in all, it's helping the prime mover. Okay? So if we go back to our picture, which of these lines is going to the synergist? Would it be this one or probably this one? First one, second one? All right, it's the second. The center just has to kind of run the same direction and be located generally near the prime mover. So it's this one right here. It's one you probably haven't heard of, or most of you probably haven't. It's the brachialis. Okay, so it's going to aid that prime mover. Now then, also at the joint, we're going to have a muscle that works against, does the opposite of what the prime mover or the agonist wants done. Okay? So at this joint, the biceps brachii does the flexion. So there's going to be this antagonist that does the opposite. Okay? What muscle would that be? Once again, we haven't gone over them, but just triceps. Good. So we have what's called the antagonist. It opposes the prime mover. So it's the muscle that does the opposite of what the prime mover is trying to do. Okay? Okay? Prevents excess movement or injury. Okay? So this muscle contracts, the antagonist would then extend. It can contract a little bit while you're flexing. It helps slow down the movement. And when you get towards the end, it contracts a little bit so that you don't overdo it and hurt the joint. That's what it's supposed to do. And you guys already nailed, it's the triceps. The triceps are in the back of the arm. So that would be our antagonist muscle. Okay. Lastly, we have what's called a fixator. Okay. We don't always have a fixator, but some joints we do. If we go back to our picture, notice the biceps brachii crosses how many joints? Does it cross just one, or does it cross more than one? Two. Okay? So this is the scapula, right? One of the heads of the biceps brachii attaches to that coracoid process. Okay, so we know that's on the scapula. It must cross over the humerus and then comes down here and attaches to radius and ulna. So it's crossing two joints. So technically, when this muscle contracts and this pulls this end towards this end, two things could happen. We could pull this bone up into flexion, or we could pull this scapula down and kind of rotate it downward, right? That'd be the two things that could happen. What a fixator does is when a muscle crosses more than one joint, it'll fix one joint in place so that the movement will take place down here. So over here, you have muscles that attach to the scapula running towards the spine, and they'll contract and anchor this so it won't tip, so that the motion is directed down there at the elbow joint. And so the fixator is the rhomboideus. There's rhomboideus major and minor. We're just kind of grouping them together. I'll go back to that picture. So the fixator prevents movement of one of the bones the prime mover is attached to. Okay? And you may have noticed that indirectly. Okay? If you go to the gym and you're working your biceps brachii, you're doing curls, right? And so when you're standing there working out with Dr. Sinner and he's got like 5 pounds on each end and he's just straining, the rhomboideus in my back has to contract, and my low back muscles, if I'm doing them standing, to keep me from falling forward. Okay, so sometimes if you're doing this enough, you'll actually feel some tension or soreness in your back because those are fixing your scapula. They're fixing your low back not to bend forward. And you're thinking, what? That doesn't make any sense because I was just doing curls. Why is my back a little bit sore? Okay, that's why. All right, so 3 types of muscle. You've already told me these. What are the 3 types? Skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. So because they're all muscle, they're going to have similar characteristics. But they're not going to be exactly the same, or we wouldn't have 3 different types, right? So basically each one has both common features and there's unique features that separate them. All right. Like I said, this is mostly skeletal, but we're going to kind of contrast them with the other ones. So skeletal muscle. this is what skeletal muscle kind of looks like. It's got these striations, kind of dark light, dark light, dark light, dark light. And we can't even see the ends. This is a muscle fiber. We can't even see how far the beginning or the end goes. They're very long. And because of that, they're going to have more than one nucleus. They're going to be all spread out through the cell. Okay? So skeletal muscle, muscle fiber, very long, that's why we call it a fiber. Skeletal muscle attaches primarily to bone, you already told me that, but then can do the dermis in the face. Okay, you guys are worried about your practical, aren't you? So attaches to bones, can attach to the face. Skeletal muscle is voluntary. What's that mean? You have control of it, okay? Your brain sends signals to the skeletal muscle and tells it what to do, all right? All right, so the skeletal muscle won't do anything unless you tell it to. It has this striated appearance that you guys can see. Okay, it looks kind of like a hot pink tiger print, and it's multinucleated. Sometimes I like to show you my hot pink thong that I wear, but last time they were throwing dollar bills at me and it just got out of hand. All right, at least some of us are awake, because that's a hideous thing. You either got to laugh or think, oh God, don't say that. All right, muscle fibers. They're multinucleated, more than one nucleus. It's because of the length of the muscle. The plasma membrane of the muscle is called the sarcolemma. So sarco is another prefix that kind of goes with muscle. Okay? Would have been nice if they'd have just stuck with myo and been the myolemma, but instead it's called the sarcolemma. And it goes up and down the cell, right? Plasma membrane always is what defines the cell. It's the outer border of the cell. Outside of that outer border of the sarcolemma, we're going to have connective tissue, and it's going to be what kind? Endomysium. Good. Now, this sarcolemma has another characteristic about it known as transverse T-tubules. So you have to think of a muscle fiber in 3 dimensions. Okay, it's very long, but it has some depth to it. Okay, if we stretched one out here, it has some depth, and the sarcolemma goes across the surface. Okay, that's the plasma membrane. We said when we stimulate a muscle, we have a change across the plasma membrane, and that's what gets conducted down. Transverse T-tubules, if this is the fiber going this way, the tubules go down into the muscle. Okay? So it's part of that sarcolemma that actually goes down into the muscle so that that change in charge gets conducted to the deeper myofibrils and myofilaments that are in the muscle. Does that make sense? No? Maybe? Maybe? No? Not so much? Let's see if I got a picture, if I got to draw something. Drawing is very bad. Well, we got a picture. Well, we'll see if we can do with the picture. Okay? And so this allows us to carry that electrical charge, that change in charge, down into the interior, the deeper portions of that muscle fiber. So if the muscle membrane is called the sarcolemma, what are we going to call the cell cytoplasm of the muscle? Sarcoplasm. There we go. So in and amongst the sarcoplasm is where we're going to find the myofibrils, comprised of smaller subunits known as myofilaments. We're also going to store some sugar there. The form of sugar, the way we store it, is called glycogen. So we store some sugar in there for these muscle contractions. And, sugar, what else do we need with sugar to make ATP? Oxygen. Okay, good. So we're going to store some oxygen in the muscle as well, bound to what's called myoglobin. Does myoglobin sound like anything else you might have heard of before? Hemoglobin. What's hemoglobin do? Carries oxygen. So on the red blood cell, carries oxygen. So now we've got muscle, myoglobin, something that's holding oxygen in the muscle. Okay? Because obviously, using your skeletal muscles could be a life or death situation. You could be defending yourself, trying to keep yourself alive, or running away. And so The body stores some of this there so that you have it, okay? And the more you exercise, you'll store a little bit more there, and you'll get better at aerobic respiration as well with that. We have the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is a muscle's endoplasmic reticulum. And in these muscle fibers, there's kind of large pockets called terminal cisternae. They're just parts of the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The sarcoplasmic reticulum's job is to store calcium because calcium is necessary for muscle contraction. In fact, the more calcium you release onto a muscle, the stronger it will contract. The faster you release it onto the calcium, the more powerful the contraction will be. So if you train your muscles and you get the ability to release a lot of calcium on the muscle really quickly, you'll have strong, powerful contractions. Might help you run faster, jump higher, which is usually things that help in sports. So here's a picture of a muscle fiber, or actually a myofibril. And these are the lines in here are the myofilaments that we haven't talked about yet. But around the outside of each myofibril, we see this blue webbing. That's our sarcoplasmic reticulum, okay? This here is part of a transverse T-tubule, okay? So we need to get a little bigger picture to show you where that comes into play. But this wraps around each myofibril. So this change in voltage happens right over the myofibrils, myofilaments, and in conjunction with what it does is it opens up the sarcoplasmic reticulum to release calcium onto the muscle for contraction. Okay. Here's another picture. This is actually a muscle fiber. Here's a myofibril, and you can now see the lines in there being the myofilaments. Around the outside, these little holes mean there's a tunnel going down into the deeper portion. That's our transverse, or shortened, our T-tubule, and it's indicated by the purple here. So these tubules come down and they wrap around and go all around the muscle so that when this change in voltage goes across the membrane, it also goes down through these purple tunnels and sends that change to all the myofibrils, all the myofilaments. You could think of it like shocking it. All right. Doing all right? All right, here's another picture. Once again, we see this large, what's the blue here? Sarcoplasmic reticulum. We store what in there? Calcium, okay? Here, this is the sarcolemma, the membrane, and as it comes to one of these things, the charge is then conducted down these two tubules around all the myofibrils, okay? And when we stimulate this muscle, the muscle then will shorten, right? Cool. So let's see if we can label this here. So this thing right here, this whole thing, what do you think that is? Myofibril, is that what you're saying? Okay, we got somebody that's throwing out myofibril. We're going to hop on this train with her. Okay, sarcolemma. Now, I'm not wanting the outer portion of it. I want the whole thing. What would you just call this whole thing? This whole thing's a picture of a, okay, muscle fiber. So we got myofibril, muscle fiber. Okay, the way you know it's a muscle fiber is that striated appearance. Okay, so because I can see the striations here, I know this is a muscle fiber. It also has what, many nuclei. Okay, so this whole thing's a muscle fiber. If that's the case, then this little thing that they pulled out would be then a, what makes up the muscle fiber? The myofibrils, good. So this would be a myofibril, all right? This stuff that's in and around, kind of the fluid-ish part of the inside of the cell that's around those would be called the sarcoplasm, good. And the outer membrane around this muscle fiber would be the rutabaga, the sarcolemma. Good. I know some of you were writing, you were still thinking. Okay. And so these myofibrils will be made up of smaller units called myofilaments. We're going to have a thick filament and we're going to have a thin filament, okay? And they're going to be made up of different things. The thick filaments look a little bit like that. They're made up of a protein called myosin, okay? And so what you have is about 200 to 500 myosin molecules. Think of it looking kind of like a golf club, except the shafts get intertwined around each other. And you end up with looking at something like this, okay? So they have a head, and then they have this shaft that's intertwined. So we intertwine two of them with a head, and then we take about 500 of those and put them together, and that's what we call a thick filament, okay? So thick filaments are made up of myosin, okay? These heads are said to be directed outwardly in what they refer to as a spiral array. It's kind of hard to see it, but this wraps around in a spiral, like a screw shape, okay? And it goes this way. The center portion doesn't have any heads, okay? It just has the shafts running through here, all right? So heads directed outward in a spiral array. This portion in the center where there are no heads is called the bare zone. The other filament is called the thin filament, okay? And it's down here. It's these orange beads, okay? So this is made up, the thin filament's made up of two thin proteins called actin, okay? And so this is an actin, and this is an actin. So two of these, and they're kind of twisted together, and they're made up of smaller subunits called G-actin or globular actin, okay? So two twisted strands of fibrous actin are made up of these subunits known as globular actin, okay? Now, these subunits, these beads, each of those beads has what's called an active site, okay? And the active sites are blocked when the muscle's relaxed. So where are the active sites? They're actually underneath this white strip, okay? This white strip's called tropomyosin. It blocks the active sites. All right? Tropomyosin has another protein bound to it called troponin. Troponin has a binding site for calcium. When calcium binds to troponin, this whole thing, which they call the troponin-tropomyosin complex, changes shape, and it bends the other way. So let's say it banana shapes this way. That then exposes those active sites. The active site's just an opening for binding to take place. So what do you think is going to stick itself in that active site that we just saw? The myosin head? It's a great guess, you guys. Awesome. All right. So tropomyosin blocks the active sites for about 6 or 7 of these globular actins. It has troponin attached to it. We call it the troponin-tropomyosin complex. And when calcium binds to it, it changes shape. It exposes those active sites. So now the myosin head can bind to it. Okay? And that's essentially where contraction is going to start to take place. All right? So what we're going to do now is we're going to turn this over to a former student of mine. Her name's Sarah. All right? Sarah's just finished nursing, what, 6 months ago? Nursing program? Not even that long? Okay, in her residency. So she was just going to talk to you about what life's like after the 201s and 202 classes and the micro, because I know a lot of you, like this, you walk into this class and it's like, F-bomb. This is really hard because everything else has been pretty easy for you to this point. And what takes a while for some people to realize is all that other stuff, that was like fluff. This is what your classes are going to be like. So she's just going to give you a little insight into what it's like, what's coming up, why study skills you develop now will be important. All right? So I'm going to give her 15 minutes or so. And she's really nice. She worked really hard in this class. She'll tell you that I'm probably as mean as you think I am.